What do we do with the stories that refuse to stay buried? Not the ones polished by Hollywood or softened by nostalgia, but the older, stranger ones that cling to a place long after the witnesses are gone. They remain in courthouse archives, in yellowed newspapers, in the voices of people who once tried to describe what they saw and found that ordinary language was too small. Again and again, across generations, the pattern returns. Something appears at the edge of the known world, is seen clearly enough to unsettle, and then disappears before certainty can arrive. We like to think history moves in a straight line, from darkness into knowledge, that every mystery is simply a fact waiting for better instruments. And often that is true. A light in the sky becomes a meteor. A shape in the woods becomes an owl, a wolf, a trick of nerves and weather. But some accounts resist that tidy ending, not because they prove the impossible, but because they reveal how fragile the border can be between what is observed and what is understood. In small towns and remote fields, on quiet roads and under failing streetlights, people have paused and looked into the night with the same ancient instinct, to name what is there before it names us. Sometimes they found an answer. Sometimes they found a story. And sometimes they found something that lived in between, part animal, part omen, part mirror held up to human fear. This is not a journey into certainty. It is a journey into testimony, memory, and the uneasy space where both meet. We will move through ruined industrial grounds, rural farmhouses, forgotten roads, riverbanks, and villages that once learned how quickly rumor can become atmosphere. In each place, someone saw something that altered the emotional weather of an entire community. Maybe these encounters tell us more about the human mind than about hidden creatures. Maybe they reveal how loneliness, danger, grief, and expectation can give shape to the dark. Or maybe, every so often, the world allows a silhouette to pass across its surface without explanation. And maybe what stays with us is not the creature itself, but the feeling it leaves behind. That reality is wider than our confidence and older than our categories. What if the first sign of a mystery is not a scream, but silence? Not the kind that settles over a sleeping town, but the kind that arrives when ordinary life suddenly feels watched. In 19X along the Ohio River Valley, that silence began to gather around a place already heavy with history, an abandoned World War II munitions site outside Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Locals called it the TNT area. Concrete bunkers sank into the earth. Ponds reflected broken fences and winter trees. It was the sort of landscape that seemed to remember too much. One November night, two young couples drove through those deserted roads, expecting nothing more than a brief escape from town. What they later described would become one of the most enduring encounters in American folklore. They said they saw a tall figure rise near one of the old structures, gray and man-shaped, but not quite human. Its most arresting feature, they recalled, was not claws or wings, but a pair of glowing red eyes that seemed to hold them in place. When they fled in their car, they believed the figure followed, gliding above the road with impossible ease. The story traveled fast, because fear always does. Soon other residents began reporting strange sights near the same decaying grounds. A large winged shape, a sudden movement in the headlights, the sensation that something immense had been standing just beyond the beam of a flashlight. Reporters arrived, sketches appeared. The name came later, borrowed from popular culture and hardened into myth, Mothman. Yet the deeper story was never only about a creature. It was about a town trying to interpret a disturbance in its emotional landscape. The sightings emerged in a season already touched by anxiety, Cold War unease, and the slow erosion of trust in institutions that once promised order. A neglected military site became the perfect stage for uncertainty. When people stepped into that ruined space, they were not just entering a patch of wilderness. They were walking into the leftovers of modern power, a place where the nation's machinery had gone quiet and left behind its shadows. Was there truly something in the air above Point Pleasant? A rare bird glimpsed under pressure? A misreading shaped by darkness and expectation? Perhaps, but even the most reasonable explanation does not erase what the witnesses felt, that for a few breathless moments, the world stopped behaving like itself. And once a community has felt that together, the question is no longer only what was seen. It is why certain places seem ready to receive our fear and turn it into legend. What happens when fear no longer belongs to one family or one road, but to an entire countryside? In the hills and fields of 18th century France, long before cameras and radio, a different kind of terror took hold. It moved in daylight, it crossed pastures, it left behind not just rumor, but mourning. Between 1764 and 67, in the region once known as Gevaudan, reports spread of a predator unlike any villagers believed they knew. Wolves were part of rural life. People understood their danger. But survivors described something larger, stranger, and more deliberate. They spoke of a reddish coat marked by darker streaks, a broad chest, a long tail, and a head that seemed wrong in its proportions, as if nature had written the familiar shape of a wolf and then revised it in a harsher hand. The attacks were brutal and deeply personal. This was not merely livestock taken at the edge of the forest. The creature, or creatures, seemed drawn toward people themselves, shepherds, children, women working open land. Witnesses said it struck boldly, often aiming for the face and throat. Those who escaped carried back not only wounds, but descriptions that echoed one another with unsettling precision. Soon the fear widened beyond the villages. Patrols formed, hunters swept through woods and valleys. Priests folded the killings into sermons about judgment and providence. Eventually, even the French crown intervened. Wolves were shot in large numbers. Carcasses were displayed. Each time, officials hoped the story had ended. Yet the attacks continued, and with them the suspicion that this was no ordinary animal. At last, in 1767, a large wolf was killed, and the violence seemed to stop. For some, that was enough. For others, the questions only sharpened. Was Gevaudan haunted by one exceptional predator? By several animals blurred into a single legend? Or by fear shaping memory into a single face? Perhaps the enduring mystery lies there. When danger visits often enough, communities do not merely record it. They give it a form they can speak to, pray against, and remember. How does a legend begin in an age of photographs? Sometimes with a single frame, sometimes with a shape that should not be standing where it stands. In the American Southwest, across decades of heat, open desert, and military secrecy, stories have gathered around a towering figure had to walk like a man and yet belong to no known species. The name most people use is simple and almost childlike, Bigfoot. But in some accounts, especially in the drier lands of the West, the image is less like a fairy tale giant and more like a living interruption in the landscape. One of the most famous moments came in 1967 when two men filming in the forests of Northern California captured a brief, unstable strip of footage that would travel further than they ever could have imagined. The figure in that film does not rush. It turns almost calmly as if aware of being seen. For many, the clip became a cultural Rorschach test. Some saw an undiscovered primate. Others saw a man in a costume. What mattered was not just what the footage proved, but what it awakened. The possibility that modern cameras might preserve mystery instead of dissolving it. From there, reports multiplied across the continent. Hunters described massive footprints impressed into mud. Campers spoke of heavy movement beyond the tree line, of stones thrown into firelight, of a smell so rank it seemed to announce an unseen presence before any sound arrived. In the desert versions of the story, the creature was sometimes leaner, more severe, crossing dry washes or ridgelines at dusk like a memory from a much older world. Science, understandably, asks for bones, tissue, repeatable evidence. And yet folklore persists because experience rarely arrives in laboratory form. A witness sees something once, under pressure in fading light, and carries the uncertainty for years. The gap between evidence and emotion becomes the home of the legend. Perhaps that is why Bigfoot endures, not because it has been proved, but because it stands at the edge of a longing many people still carry, the hope that somewhere beyond roads, maps, and satellite views, there remains a form of life that has not yet been cataloged. And if such a being were possible, what else in the world have we mistaken for emptiness simply because we stopped looking with humility? Can a mystery survive the bright light of modern newsrooms? In Puerto Rico during the 1990s, one did more than survive. It spread, not through ancient chronicles or campfire retellings, but through television reports, radio call-ins, tabloid headlines, and anxious conversations carried from one neighborhood to the next. The creature at the center of those accounts was given a name that sounded almost clinical in its simplicity: Chupacabra, the goat sucker. The first wave of stories arrived with dead animals. Goats, chickens, and other livestock were found drained of blood, or so witnesses believed, their bodies marked by puncture wounds and strangely little surrounding chaos. In farming communities, where animals are livelihood as much as property, such discoveries landed with unusual force. People did not speak only of economic loss. They spoke of violation, of something crossing into the ordinary world and taking what should have been safe behind a fence or barn door. Descriptions of the creature varied, but certain images repeated often enough to shape the public imagination. Witnesses spoke of a small to medium-sized being, upright or nearly so, with dark skin, sharp features, and spines running down its back. In some retellings, it seemed reptilian. In others, almost extraterrestrial. The inconsistency did not weaken the legend. It gave it room to grow. Soon the reports moved beyond Puerto Rico, surfacing in parts of Latin America and the southern United States. Each new account added detail and removed certainty. Biologists pointed toward disease, scavengers, wild dogs with mange, and the powerful distortions caused by fear and low light. These explanations carried weight. Yet for those who had stood over an animal at dawn and felt that something unnatural had visited in the night, reason and emotion were not easy to reconcile. The Chupacabra became more than a creature story. It became a portrait of a media age learning how quickly an image can outrun evidence. A rumor, once local, could now travel with the speed of broadcast and return wearing new features. But beneath the headlines, the older human pattern remained intact. Something unexplained touched the edge of daily life, and people searched for a shape large enough to hold their unease. Maybe that is why the story endured. Not because every claim was true in the literal sense, but because the fear behind it was real. It spoke to vulnerability, to the feeling that even in a world crowded with cameras and experts, the night still belongs partly to what we cannot name. What if the thing people remember most is not the creature itself, but the moment the familiar world tilted around it? On a September evening in 1952, in the small town of Flatwoods, West Virginia, several boys looked up and saw a bright object streak across the sky and drop beyond a nearby hill. In another setting, it might have become a brief local curiosity, a meteor discussed over breakfast and forgotten by the weekend. But curiosity has a way of gathering company. The boys ran for help, and before long, a small group of adults and children set out toward the place where they believed something had landed. The night was already cooling. Grass and brush held the last of the day's moisture. At first, those climbing the hill noticed only a pulsing reddish glow. Then a flashlight beam caught something standing beyond it, and the ordinary logic of the evening seemed to come apart. The witnesses later described a towering figure with a dark body and a head shaped in a way that none of them could easily compare to any known animal. Some said it resembled a hood. Others reached for the language of bards and symbols. What returned in nearly every account were the eyes, bright, reflective, and fixed. The figure did not rush toward them. That may be part of why the encounter lingered so powerfully in memory. A charging animal invites action. A silent presence invites interpretation. Witnesses said it seemed to hover or glide rather than walk. One person recalled a hissing sound. Several later described nausea, irritation in the throat, and a metallic odor hanging in the air long after they fled the hillside. By morning, the story had moved beyond Flatwoods. Artists sketched the figure. Reporters sharpened the details. Investigators offered calmer possibilities. A meteor in the sky, an owl in a tree, panic enlarging shape and distance in the dark. Those explanations remain plausible. And yet, the image endured because it did not feel random to those who were there. It felt coherent, shared, immediate. Perhaps that is what gives some mysteries their staying power. Not that they defeat reason, but that they arrive already shaped, as if the mind and the night have collaborated on a single unforgettable outline. And when several people carry home the same outline, the question grows harder to dismiss. Did they witness an error of perception so precise it became communal? Or did something stand on that hill for a minute or two, long enough to remind them that astonishment is sometimes the oldest fact of all? What if a monster is born not only from what was seen, but from the landscape that receives the sighting? In the marshlands of South Carolina, where water and shadow are rarely separate for long, the story of the lizard man emerged from a place already fluent in ambiguity. Swamps do that. They soften the edges of things. Sound travels strangely. Distance becomes unreliable. The eye, however careful, is always negotiating with reflection. In the summer of 1988, near the town of Bishopville, a young man reported a terrifying encounter on a lonely road after a flat tire forced him to stop. He later described hearing movement, then seeing a tall creature with glowing red eyes, greenish skin, and a powerful build unlike any animal he knew. According to his account, it lunged at the car, gripping and clawing at the vehicle as he struggled to escape. When he finally made it home, the car bore scratches and visible damage. The marks gave the story weight. Fear had left a trace. Soon other residents began sharing their own experiences. Some described glimpses near scape or swamp. Others found unusual tracks or reported noises too heavy to assign to deer or dogs. Local authorities investigated. Journalists arrived. The name Lizard Man, irresistible to headlines, spread quickly and took on a life larger than any single testimony. A community that had lived for years with ordinary rural uncertainties now found itself mapped by a new kind of attention. Skeptics pointed to misidentification, pranks, and the human habit of organizing scattered incidents into one dramatic narrative. They were not wrong to do so. The car damage could have had more mundane causes. The tracks were difficult to verify. Memory, especially after fear, is not a camera. Yet the persistence of the story says something important. People were not responding only to evidence. They were responding to atmosphere, to a place that already felt older and less legible than the paved world around it. In that sense, the lizard man became a local expression of a universal feeling, the sense that some environments still resist our need to classify them. A swamp is not empty simply because we cannot see through it. It holds life below the surface, motion under stillness, histories buried in mud and reeds. Perhaps that is why stories like this take root there so easily. They remind us that mystery does not always arrive from distant galaxies or remote centuries. Sometimes it rises from the nearest dark water, asking whether the world is truly as familiar as our maps would like us to believe. What if the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that happen close to home, in places too ordinary to prepare us for wonder? In the spring of 1907, in the quiet village of Enfield, Illinois, one family claimed their evening was broken by something that did not belong to any familiar category. There were no ancient ruins, no military compounds, no dramatic wilderness. Just a yard, a house, a few moments of confusion, and then the kind of fear that turns an address into a legend. The first reports were almost difficult to picture. A strange sound outside, a figure glimpsed in the dark. Then a fuller description began to take shape. A small creature, grayish in color, with a body that seemed awkward and yet oddly agile. Some witnesses said it had 3 legs. Others focused on its large eyes and the way it moved, not with the smooth motion of a known animal, but in abrupt, startling bounds. One account insisted it leaped great distances in seconds, as if the usual agreement between gravity and flesh had somehow been suspended. Police were called. Reporters followed. Soon the story left the neighborhood and entered the broader American imagination, where it became one more entry in a growing archive of creatures that seemed to appear briefly and then vanish into explanation or myth. Investigators searched for tracks and signs. Skeptics offered practical theories. A frightened animal misidentified at night, perhaps a kangaroo escaped from captivity, perhaps several ordinary details compressed by panic into one extraordinary memory. Those possibilities matter because not every mystery requires the impossible, but they do not erase the deeper human texture of the encounter. For the people involved, the event did not feel like folklore. It felt immediate, embarrassing even. To report something absurd is to risk becoming absurd in the eyes of others. That is part of what gives such stories their strange dignity. People speak not because the tale flatters them, but because it unsettles them enough that silence becomes harder to carry. The Enfield story reminds us that mystery does not always announce itself with grandeur. Sometimes it enters through the back door of ordinary life and leaves behind a disturbance out of all proportion to its brief visit. And perhaps that is why such accounts endure. They suggest that the unknown is not confined to distant mountains or forgotten centuries. It may be waiting, quietly, at the edge of the familiar, where the safest landscapes reveal how little certainty routine can actually provide. What if the sea keeps its mysteries not because they are impossible to solve, but because the ocean was never built for certainty? Along the coasts of the North Atlantic, fishermen and sailors have long carried stories of immense shapes moving beneath the surface, forms too large and too deliberate to dismiss as waves or fatigue. In calmer centuries, such tales were folded into myth. In the modern age, they entered newspapers and scientific debate under a more measured name, sea serpent. One of the most famous American episodes unfolded in the harbor waters near Gloucester, Massachusetts, in the early 19th century. Witnesses reported a long, dark creature moving through the sea with a strange rhythm, its body rising and falling in visible arcs. Some described a head lifted above the water, almost curious in its bearing. Others focused on the length, insisting that no known seal, whale, or drifting debris could account for what they had seen. The reports multiplied until the story became a public event, drawing ministers, merchants, and naturalists into the same argument. That argument was never only about one animal. It was about the limits of observation itself. Water distorts scale, distance flattens detail. The mind tries to organize fragments into a coherent whole, especially when the whole appears only briefly. A line of porpoises can resemble one undulating body. A whale moving at an odd angle can seem like something entirely new. Science has good reason to be cautious. And yet caution does not erase the fact that many witnesses were experienced people of the sea, individuals whose livelihoods depended on distinguishing one movement from another. What survives in these accounts is not proof, but humility. The ocean has always reminded us that vastness can make even confident minds provisional. We chart coastlines, track currents, map the seafloor, and still enormous portions of the marine world remain unseen in any intimate sense. New species continue to emerge from depths where sunlight does not reach. Each discovery quietly rebuking the old assumption that the unknown must also be the impossible. Perhaps that is why sea serpent stories endure. They give narrative form to a truth the ocean teaches better than almost anything else, that the world is not obligated to reveal itself in full. Sometimes what matters is not whether one particular creature was real, but whether the encounter renewed a necessary habit of mind. To look across dark water and admit that wonder, even now, has not finished with us. What if the creature in the story is less important than the silence it leaves behind? In the winter of 1961, a quiet stretch of road near Whitehall, New York, became the setting for an encounter that would ripple through local memory for decades. It was the kind of place where night arrived completely, where the trees closed in and every sound seemed to come from farther away than it really was. For one witness, that darkness briefly opened to reveal something enormous and upright at the roadside, a figure that looked both animal and strangely human. Descriptions varied, as they often do, but the outline remained remarkably consistent. The being was said to be tall, broad, covered in dark hair, and powerfully built. It did not dart like a startled deer or vanish like a trick of light. It stood there with a kind of composure, as if the road, the woods, and the witness all belonged equally to the same moment. Then it was gone, absorbed back into the landscape before certainty could catch up. In the months and years that followed, other reports emerged from the surrounding region. Footprints were found. Hunters spoke of a presence they could not identify. Residents told stories in lowered voices, half wary of ridicule and half unwilling to dismiss what neighbors claimed to have seen. Whitehall gradually became known as one of the East Coast's own centers of Bigfoot lore, far from the rainforests and mountains more commonly linked to such accounts. That shift mattered. It suggested that mystery was not confined to some remote frontier. It could step out anywhere the land still held enough darkness. Investigators, of course, searched for harder answers. Misidentification, hoaxing, ordinary wildlife magnified by bad conditions all remain reasonable possibilities. There is wisdom in skepticism, but there is also wisdom in noticing what keeps such stories alive. Rarely is it only the shape of the creature. More often, it is the emotional residue, the feeling that for an instant, the world presented something ancient and self-possessed, something that did not need human recognition in order to exist. That may be the quiet power of encounters like Whitehall. They ask us to reconsider the arrogance hidden inside familiarity. We drive the same roads, live beside the same woods, and begin to imagine that repetition is the same thing as knowledge. Yet the natural world has never signed that agreement. It continues beside us, older than our categories, withholding more than it reveals. And perhaps the real mystery is not whether something unknown once stood in the road, but why we are so unsettled by the possibility that the world might still contain a life that has managed to remain beyond our naming. What if the strangest encounters are the ones that unfold in full daylight, before there is time for imagination to prepare its defense? In the summer of 1888, near the town of Exeter in Rhode Island, two laborers working in a field reported seeing something extraordinary rise from the earth in front of them. There was no storm, no midnight gloom, no lonely road to color the moment, only open ground, sunlight, and the shock of witnessing a form they could not fit into the known order of animals. Their description would later echo through regional folklore: a bizarre creature with the body of a man and the head, or perhaps the face, of a frog. It was said to move with sudden force, springing away in great leaps before disappearing from view. The image sounds almost theatrical now, too peculiar for modern confidence. Yet that is part of what gives the account its staying power. Hoaxes usually borrow familiar fears. This story offered something less convenient, more dreamlike, and therefore harder to dismiss as a simple invention shaped for effect. As word spread, by Dishon, the creature came to be known as the Hopkinsville. No, that belongs elsewhere. In Rhode Island, it settled into memory under another name, the Exeter Frogman. The details were debated, embellished, reduced, then revived again over time. Some versions softened the figure into a large amphibian. Others kept its unsettling human proportions intact. No body was found. No conclusive explanation took hold. The event remained balanced in that peculiar space between local anecdote and enduring mystery. Natural explanations are not difficult to propose. Witnesses may have encountered an injured animal, a misperceived movement, an ordinary creature seen under unusual conditions, and translated through surprise into something half-human. The mind is a quick interpreter, but not always a careful one. Still, the persistence of the story reveals something larger than evidence. It shows how communities remember the moments that make reality feel briefly unstable, when a field becomes a stage and the familiar world seems to improvise. Perhaps that is what these tales offer at their most valuable. Not proof of hidden species, but testimony to our unfinished relationship with the natural world. We still hunger to believe that life may take forms we have not accounted for, that the map is incomplete, that the ordinary landscape can still produce astonishment. And when a witness says with all sincerity that something impossible once leaped through the afternoon light, the deeper question may not be whether they were right. It may be why that possibility still feels, in some quiet part of us, worth keeping alive. What if some mysteries endure because they arrive not as a single event, but as a pattern people slowly learn to fear? Across the flat roads and scattered fields of rural Wisconsin, one such pattern settled over Bray Road near the town of Elkhorn. It did not emerge from one dramatic night alone, but from repeated claims over years, told by drivers, late workers, and residents who insisted they had seen a figure unlike anything they could easily explain. The name attached to it was blunt and ancient in its implication: the Beast of Bray Road. Witnesses often described a tall, muscular creature covered in dark hair, moving upright with an unsettling confidence. Some said it was crouched at the roadside, feeding on roadkill, or studying something in the ditch. Others reported seeing it run on two legs before dropping to all fours with an ease that made it seem both human and animal, but fully neither. A few accounts emphasized glowing eyes. Others remembered the weight of the silence around it, the way even the act of passing by in a car felt like crossing too close to a boundary. By the late 20th century, the story had gathered enough force that local reporting gave it a wider audience. That mattered. Once a mystery enters print, it changes. It no longer belongs only to those who saw it. It becomes communal property, shaped by skepticism, fascination, and repetition. Some readers laughed. Some grew more attentive when driving isolated roads at night. And some began to reinterpret earlier odd sightings through the lens of the new legend, as though the name itself had pulled older fragments into focus. Explanations came readily, as they should. Misidentified bears, especially under poor conditions, can appear startlingly human for an instant. Large dogs, shifting light, fear, and expectation can do the rest. Folklore also has a way of borrowing old European images of werewolves and planting them in American soil. A lonely road becomes an ideal setting for that inheritance. Still, none of that fully explains why the witnesses sounded less thrilled than burdened, as though they were reporting not a fantasy fulfilled, but an experience they would rather have avoided. That may be the deeper current running beneath Bray Road. The story is not really about proving a beast exists. It is about the strange authority of repeated unease. When enough people across enough time say that a certain place feels altered by what they have seen there, the road itself begins to change in the imagination. And perhaps that is one of mystery's oldest powers, not to give us but to transform an ordinary stretch of earth into a question we keep asking long after the headlights move on. What if the last and most difficult mystery is not the creature, but the way we continue to carry it? By the time these stories reach us, through archives, retellings, interviews, and weathered local memory, the original moment is already gone. What remains is a human relay. One person trying to describe what unsettled them, another trying to preserve it, another trying to explain it away, and still another hearing in it an echo of something they themselves have felt but never named. Over time, the creature changes. The feeling does not. Across all these encounters, a pattern begins to emerge. The setting is often liminal: a ruined industrial tract, a swamp, a farm at dusk, a roadside, a field, a harbor, a hillside under strange light. These are thresholds, places where categories loosen. The witnesses are rarely prophets or performers. More often they are workers, couples, drivers, children, families, people moving through ordinary life until it briefly ceases to feel ordinary. They look up or out or ahead, and for a few seconds the world becomes difficult to translate. That difficulty matters. We live in a culture that rewards certainty, even when certainty is hurried or shallow. To say, "I don't know what I saw," is one of the more honest and vulnerable sentences a person can offer. It invites ridicule. It also invites wonder. And perhaps that is why these stories remain alive. Not because they defeat science, but because they preserve a human experience. Science itself begins with the recognition that reality often appears before it is understood. Some mysteries will likely dissolve under better evidence. Others may remain suspended forever between misidentification and possibility. That uncertainty need not disappoint us. In some ways, it is the point. These accounts remind us that knowledge is not a wall we finish building. It is a shoreline. Every generation walks it, collecting what it can, while the larger darkness moves beside it with patience. And so, before this journey closes, one truth lingers above all the sightings and names. Monsters, whether literal or imagined, are often vessels for something more enduring. Shaw, grief, isolation, memory, the fear of being vulnerable in a vast world. But they also carry another message, quieter and more generous. They ask us to remain open, to let humility survive in an age of instant conclusions. To remember that even now, in places we think we know, something unexplained may still pass briefly through the edge of our vision and leave us a little less certain and perhaps a little more alive. So where does that leave us? After the roads and marshes, the fields, harbors, forests, and abandoned grounds have faded back into darkness, perhaps in a place both older and wiser than certainty. These stories began as encounters with something unnamed, but they end as meditations on the limits of vision, the persistence of memory, and the deep human need to make meaning from what unsettles us. We set out looking for monsters. What we found, again and again, was ourselves standing at the edge of explanation. That may sound like a reduction, but it is not. To say a mystery reveals human nature is not to say the mystery is false. It is to recognize that every encounter has two dimensions. There is the event itself, whatever truly happened in the moment, and there is the act of carrying it afterward. The retelling, the doubt, the embarrassment, the conviction, the transformation of a private shock into shared narrative. Between those two dimensions, legends are born, not as failures of reason, but as records of how people live with the unknown. In that sense, these tales endure because they speak to a permanent condition of being human. We are creatures of pattern and imagination, but also of evidence and restraint. We want the world to be understandable, yet part of us remains grateful that it is not entirely so. A fully explained universe might be safer. It would also be smaller. Mystery, handled honestly, keeps the world spacious. It reminds us that knowledge is still unfolding, that perception is imperfect, and that wonder is not the enemy of truth, but often its beginning. Maybe every generation invents the language of its fears and hopes through different figures. Beasts in the woods, shapes in the sky, voices in the deep. But beneath those changing forms lies the same ancient recognition. We are never fully alone in the world, because the world itself is larger, stranger, and more alive than our categories can contain. Whether the creatures were real in flesh, mistaken in darkness, or assembled by memory from fragments of fear, they continue to ask something valuable of us: to look carefully, to speak humbly, and to resist the temptation to confuse familiarity with understanding. And perhaps that is the final gift of these long-carried stories. Not proof, not closure. Something better. They remind us that truth is sometimes approached indirectly, through awe, through uncertainty, through the trembling honesty of witnesses who can only say that for one brief moment, reality seemed wider than expected. In the end, maybe that is what we are really listening for. Not the footstep in the forest or the shadow over the road, but the quiet invitation beneath it all, to remain curious, to remain compassionate, and to accept that some of the most important questions in human life are the ones we may never answer completely.